Sometimes fate delivers exactly what you need in the moment you believe you have nothing left to offer the world. Harold Ruiz had been raising his 7-year-old daughter alone in the industrial town of Millbrook Heights, working double shifts at the automotive plant and coming home to microwave dinners and bedtime stories for one. 4 years since his wife died in a factory accident, he'd built a fragile existence around overtime pay and his daughter Carmen's bright smile echoing through their cramped apartment above the corner deli. Then, one rainy evening changes everything. Through the downpour, Harold witnesses a sedan careening off the mountain highway and plunging into Clearwater Creek, crying voices cutting through the storm that pierce straight through his exhausted heart. He pulls twin boys from the wreckage without hesitation, wrapping them in his work jacket and speaking in the gentle tones that once soothed Carmen's nightmares about why mommy couldn't come home anymore. What Harold doesn't realize is that these aren't ordinary children. They belong to Dr. Victoria Sterling, a renowned neurosurgeon whose precision in the operating room is matched only by the careful distance she maintains from her own heart since the day motherhood was thrust upon her. But here's the question that will transform both their lives forever. What happens when the universe decides that two people who have lost everything are meant to find healing together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz at 5:15 a.m. had become Harold's most reliable companion over the past 4 years, though he'd learned that starting the day with anger only made the hours ahead feel heavier. He'd chosen to sound like distant rain instead, something that eased him from whatever dreams still visited during the brief hours before dawn painted the sky above Millbrook Heights in shades of industrial gray. His bare feet found the cold linoleum of the bedroom he'd once shared with Maria, though her side had grown permanently cold. The morning ritual was automatic now, almost meditative in its precision. Pull on yesterday's jeans from the chair beside the bed, grab a clean factory shirt from the dresser, splash cold water on his face while avoiding the mirror that reflected back a man who looked decades older than his 32 years. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter anymore. They were from squinting through too many overtime shifts, searching assembly line components for defects while his mind wandered to grocery lists and parent-teacher conferences he'd have to miss. Down the narrow hallway, he paused outside Carmen's door, listening for the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing. 7 years old, all knees and elbows and endless questions about why stars disappeared during the day, why birds knew where to fly in winter, why mommy couldn't come back even though she'd been extra good this month. Harold had stopped trying to answer that last question with anything more than gentle redirection and extra bedtime stories. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the pancakes they'd attempted together the previous Sunday, Carmen's experiment with breakfast cooking that had resulted in more batter on the ceiling than in the pan. Harold smiled at the memory as he started the ancient coffee maker, the machine Maria had rescued from a garage sale during their first year of marriage. Character, she'd said, running her delicate fingers along its dented chrome surface. Everything worth keeping has character, mi amor. He missed her voice in the morning most of all, not the passionate speeches about workers' rights or the animated discussions about Carmen's latest artwork, but the small sounds she'd made while moving through their routine. The way she hummed old songs from her childhood while making coffee, the soft sigh when she stretched awake, the gentle "Buenos dias, corazón" that had greeted him for 6 years of marriage. Now the apartment held only the sounds of one man, trying to fill the space where two had dreamed of building something lasting. The coffee was strong and black, the way his father had taught him during those early morning shifts when Harold was Carmen's age, helping sort recycling at the plant where 3 generations of Ruiz men had worked. "Life's bitter enough without asking for sugar," his father had said, though Harold suspected the old man had simply been too proud to admit he'd grown accustomed to the taste of hardship. Through the kitchen window, Millbrook Heights stretched out in the pre-dawn darkness, a collection of weathered apartment buildings and sleeping factories that had provided steady work for immigrant families since his grandfather's generation. The streetlights reflected off wet pavement like fallen stars, and somewhere in the distance, the early shift whistle echoed across the valley, where Clearwater Creek wound its way toward the larger river system that had once powered the region's prosperity. This place had been Maria's choice, not his. She'd fallen in love with the community spirit that emerged during hard times, how neighbors looked out for each other's children and shared what little they had during lean months. "We could build something here," she'd whispered during their first apartment viewing. her dreamer's eyes already imagining block parties and backyard gardens. Raise Carmen somewhere real, where people understand that family means more than blood. He'd gotten 4 years instead of forever. 4 years of rising before dawn to earn overtime pay that never quite stretched far enough. 4 years of watching other couples push strollers through the park while he navigated single parenthood with determination that sometimes felt more like stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Harold couldn't bring himself to leave Millbrook Heights, couldn't bear to pack away the proof that Maria had been here, that she'd seen beauty in this working-class community they'd chosen together. Her tools still hung in the building's shared basement workspace, available for neighbors who needed to fix a leaky pipe or build a bookshelf. Her vegetable garden plot in the community space behind their building continued to produce tomatoes and peppers that Carmen tended with serious concentration, as if maintaining her mother's plants could somehow maintain her presence in their lives. The automotive plant loomed at the edge of town, a sprawling complex that had employed 3 generations of local families and provided the steady paychecks that kept Millbrook Heights functioning. Harold's father had worked there before him, and his father before that, a legacy of Ruiz's hands assembling the components that kept America moving. The tradition had felt natural once, like putting on a well-worn coat that carried the warmth of everyone who'd worn it before. Now it felt like wearing someone else's clothes, familiar but not quite fitting right on the inside. The work was demanding but not fulfilling, necessary but not meaningful beyond the weekly paycheck that kept their small apartment and put food on a table that felt too large for just 2 people. Harold gathered his lunch in thermos, the same routine he'd followed for 8 years now, though the contents had grown simpler since Maria's death reduced their household income by more than half. Peanut butter sandwich, apple, string cheese, instant coffee that would have to sustain him through a 10-hour shift, followed by evening cleanup work at the medical center across town. He thought about Carmen, still sleeping in her princess pajamas, hair forming impossible cowlicks that would require patient brushing before school. The girl would wake in an hour, stumble to the kitchen in search of cereal and orange juice, probably forget to brush her teeth until Mrs. Gonzalez from downstairs reminded her. The elderly woman had been a godsend these past 4 years, never making Harold feel inadequate for needing help, never treating Carmen like a burden when work demands exceeded a single father's capacity. As Harold headed for the door, he could hear the first stirrings of life in the building around him. Mr. Chen starting his delivery truck in the alley, the Rodriguez family's baby crying for his morning feeding, the familiar sounds of a community waking up to face another day of making ends meet through collective effort and stubborn hope. Outside, the October morning carried the promise of rain, heavy clouds gathering over the mountains that bordered their valley like protective walls. This was the dangerous time, when mountain runoff met autumn storms, when Clearwater Creek could transform from a gentle waterway into something fierce and unpredictable. Harold had learned to read the weather the way Maria had read people, sensing trouble before it became visible. Today felt different somehow, charged with possibility that made him simultaneously hopeful and anxious. He couldn't have known that before this evening ended, his carefully constructed life would intersect with forces beyond his control, setting in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about survival, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that broken hearts could learn to heal together. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours when Harold's shift ended at the automotive plant, transforming Clearwater Creek from its usual gentle murmur into something that roared with dangerous urgency. He pulled his worn jacket tighter as he hurried toward his 15-year-old Honda, keys already in hand, mind focused on getting home to Carmen before the evening babysitter charged overtime rates they couldn't afford. The mountain highway that connected the plant to Millbrook Heights had always been treacherous during storms, its narrow curves carved into rock faces that offered little forgiveness for driver error. Tonight, the combination of heavy rain and early darkness created conditions that made even experienced locals drive with white-knuckled caution. Harold had traveled this route countless times, but something about the intensity of tonight's storm made him grip the steering wheel harder than usual. He was thinking about Carmen's upcoming school project about local history when the headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, approaching far too fast for the wet conditions. The luxury sedan behind him was weaving slightly, its driver apparently unfamiliar with the highway's particular dangers. Harold slowed down and moved as far right as possible, hoping the aggressive driver would pass safely and continue on their reckless journey without incident. But as the sedan pulled alongside his car, Harold caught a glimpse of something that made his heart stop. In the back seat, illuminated by the vehicle's interior lighting, were two small boys, who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. Their faces were pressed against the rain-streaked windows, and even in the brief moment he could see them, Harold recognized the expression of children who were frightened and trying not to show it. The sedan's driver was a woman, her profile tense with concentration as she fought to maintain control on the increasingly slippery asphalt. She was talking rapidly, possibly on a hands-free phone, her attention divided between the conversation and the deteriorating driving conditions. Harold tried to catch the woman's eye, to somehow signal that she should slow down, but the sedan was already pulling ahead with dangerous acceleration.
What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that accompanies life-changing moments. The sedan hit a patch of standing water where the highway dipped toward the creek, and Harold watched in horror as the vehicle began to hydroplane. The driver overcorrected, sending the car into a sideways skid that carried it straight through the metal guardrail with a sound like the world breaking apart. Harold slammed on his brakes, his own car sliding to a stop on the rain-slicked asphalt as the sedan disappeared over the embankment in a cascade of sparks and twisted metal. For a moment, the only sounds were the drumming of rain on his roof and the distant splash as the vehicle hit Clearwater Creek 30 feet below. Then he heard the screaming. Without conscious thought, Harold was out of his car and running toward the broken guardrail, his factory boots slipping on wet pavement as he fought to reach the embankment's edge. Below, the sedan was partially submerged in the swollen creek, its headlights creating ghostly beams beneath the dark water. The vehicle was tilted at a dangerous angle, its passenger side already disappearing beneath the surface as the current worked to claim it completely. "Help us!" The voice carried clearly through the storm, high and desperate, cutting through Harold's momentary paralysis. He could see movement in the back seat, small hands pressed against windows that were rapidly being covered by rising water. Harold pulled out his phone, hands shaking as he dialed 911, but even as he spoke to the emergency dispatcher, he knew that help would arrive too late. The creek was rising fast, fed by hours of mountain runoff, and the sedan was sinking deeper with each passing second. By the time rescue vehicles navigated the winding mountain roads, those children would be gone. 2 children trapped in submerged vehicle, mile marker 47 on Highway 15, he told the dispatcher, then ended the call and began scrambling down the steep embankment. The slope was treacherous, made worse by rain and loose gravel, but Harold had grown up exploring these mountains with his father. He knew how to find footing where others might fall. The water was shockingly cold when he reached the creek, the current stronger than he'd expected. Harold had to fight to maintain his balance as he waded toward the sedan, his clothes becoming waterlogged and heavy. Through the rear window, he could see the 2 boys more clearly now. They were indeed twins, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and matching expressions of terror that reminded him painfully of Carmen during thunderstorms. "I'm coming," he called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. "Stay calm, boys. I'm going to get you out." The sedan's rear door was jammed, either from impact damage or water pressure, but Harold found he could force the window down enough to create an opening. The twins pressed toward him immediately, their small hands pressed against the gap with desperate trust that made his chest tight with determination. "What are your names?" he asked, working to widen the opening while keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm Alex," said the boy closest to him, his voice shaking with cold and fear. "This is my brother Danny. Is our mom okay?" Harold's heart clenched as he realized he hadn't seen the driver emerge from the vehicle. The woman was still trapped in the front seat, unconscious or worse, while her children fought to survive in the back seat. But right now, Harold could only save who he could reach. "We're going to get you both out first," he told the boys, managing to pull Alex through the window opening. He was heavier than Harold had expected, his clothes waterlogged and his small body shaking violently from cold and shock. Danny came next, his extraction made more difficult by his growing panic as he watched his brother disappear from view. But Harold held firm, pulling him through the opening with strength he didn't know he possessed, driven by the same protective instinct that had carried him through 4 years of single parenthood. With both boys clinging to him, he began the treacherous journey back to shore, fighting against a current that seemed determined to claim all 3 of them. His factory work had kept him strong, but carrying 2 frightened children through rising water while maintaining his footing on slippery rocks pushed him to the absolute limit of his physical capabilities. They reached the embankment just as the sedan's roof disappeared beneath the surface of Clearwater Creek, taking with it any chance of reaching the driver, who had still shown no signs of consciousness. Harold collapsed on the muddy shore, both boys wrapped in his arms, all 3 of them sobbing from cold, exhaustion, and the terrible knowledge that someone was lost forever beneath the dark water. "Mommy?" Danny whispered, the word breaking Harold's heart into pieces he wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. "Where's our mommy?" As sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer but still too far away, Harold held 2 children who weren't his and tried to find words that could somehow make sense of senseless tragedy. He thought about Carmen, safely at home with Mrs. Gonzalez, and realized that his daughter would never again complain about her father being late from work. The rescue vehicles that finally arrived found Harold and the twins huddled together beneath his jacket, sharing body heat and grief in equal measure. As paramedics wrapped them in emergency blankets and began asking questions he couldn't answer, Harold understood that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He had saved 2 children, but he had also witnessed the destruction of their family. And somehow, in the space between heroism and heartbreak, he had become responsible for helping 2 small boys navigate a world that had just taken away everything they thought they could count on. The woman in the sedan, they would later learn, was Dr. Victoria Sterling, a brilliant neurosurgeon whose steady hands had saved countless lives, but who had been unable to save her own when Clearwater Creek claimed its due. And Harold Ruiz, factory worker and single father, would soon discover that sometimes the people we save end up saving us in return, in ways that transform tragedy into something that might, eventually, be called hope. The Millbrook Heights Community Hospital had never felt smaller than it did with Harold Ruiz sitting in its cramped waiting room, watching Alex and Danny Sterling huddled together on plastic chairs that were too large for their small frames. The boys had been wrapped in hospital blankets and given hot chocolate that neither had touched, their dark eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something no child should ever see. 3 hours had passed since the accident. 3 hours of paperwork and phone calls and gentle questions from social workers who spoke in the careful tones reserved for family tragedies. Harold had answered what he could, though his knowledge of the Sterling family extended only to what he'd witnessed during those terrible moments at Clearwater Creek. Dr. Victoria Sterling, neurosurgeon, apparently divorced, no immediate family listed in her emergency contacts beyond the 2 boys who now sat staring at linoleum floors that reflected fluorescent lighting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Mr. Ruiz," said Janet Morrison, the social worker assigned to the case, settling into the chair beside him with a manila folder that seemed too thin to contain all the questions that needed answering. "The boy's father lives in Seattle, but he's currently traveling in Europe for business. We've left messages, but it may be several days before we can reach him." Harold looked at Alex and Danny, noting the way they leaned into each other for comfort, their small hands clasped together as if physical connection could somehow anchor them in a world that had just shifted beneath their feet. Carmen did the same thing during thunderstorms.
seeking the reassurance of contact when words weren't enough to chase away fear. "What happens to them until then?" Harold asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Foster care, temporary placement with strangers who would do their best but who couldn't possibly understand the specific grief these children were carrying. "They could stay with me," Harold heard himself saying, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise Janet Morrison. "Temporarily, until their father can be reached. I have space, and my daughter is the same age. It might be easier than placing them with strangers." Janet's eyebrows raised slightly, her expression shifting from routine sympathy to careful evaluation. "Mr. Ruiz, that's very generous, but emergency placement requires background checks, home evaluations, interviews with references. The process typically takes weeks." "How long would it take to reach their father?" Harold asked, watching as Danny whispered something to his brother that made Alex nod solemnly. "Possibly a week, maybe longer, depending on where exactly he is and whether he has reliable communication access."
Harold thought about Carmen, safely at home with Mrs. Gonzalez, probably working on homework or helping prepare dinner with the methodical concentration she brought to tasks that made her feel useful. His daughter had been asking for siblings for months, constructing elaborate fantasies about big families gathered around dinner tables, backyard games that required more players than just father and daughter could provide. "What if I took emergency guardianship?" Harold suggested, the legal term coming from somewhere in his memory, possibly one of the many forms he'd filled out after Maria's death. "Just until their father arrives. These boys have been through enough trauma for one day." Alex and Danny were listening now, their attention focused on the adult conversation that would determine their immediate future. Harold could see hope beginning to flicker in their expressions, the possibility that they might not have to face another separation on top of everything else they'd lost. Janet Morrison pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with the efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic emergencies. "Let me make some calls," she said finally. "Emergency temporary guardianship is possible under these circumstances, especially given your role in their rescue. But we'd need to do a rapid home evaluation, contact your employer and references, run basic background checks." "How rapid?" Harold asked, calculating the logistics of taking two traumatized children home to an apartment that barely accommodated his existing family of two. "If everyone cooperates, possibly by this evening. The boys would need their own sleeping arrangements, adequate food and clothing, supervision during school hours." Harold mentally inventoried his resources. The apartment had a small second bedroom that he'd been using for storage since Maria's death, filled with boxes of her belongings that he hadn't been able to sort through yet. Carmen's bed was large enough to accommodate a temporary sleeping bag setup. Mrs. Gonzalez would certainly help with childcare logistics, and the elementary school was accustomed to enrolling students mid-semester due to the transient nature of Millbrook Heights' working population. "We can make it work," Harold said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "At least until their father arrives." Danny tugged on Alex's blanket, whispering urgently in his brother's ear. Alex nodded, then looked directly at Harold with an expression of mature evaluation that seemed far too old for a 7-year-old face. "Are you nice?" Alex asked, the question carrying the weight of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always what they seemed. "Do you yell at kids or hit them or make them eat things they don't like?" Harold felt his heart break a little at the careful way Alex phrased his inquiry, the practiced caution that suggested these boys had encountered adults who failed to meet even basic standards of kindness. "I don't yell unless someone's about to get hurt. I've never hit anyone in my life, and I believe kids should eat vegetables, but I'm not going to force-feed anyone broccoli." "What about monsters?" Danny asked suddenly, speaking directly to Harold for the first time since the accident. "Do you know how to check for monsters?" "I'm an expert monster checker," Harold replied solemnly. "My daughter Carmen has been monster-free for 3 years running, and I've never missed one during inspection." This earned him a small smile from Danny and what might have been the beginning of trust from Alex. Janet Morrison was already making phone calls, speaking in the rapid-fire shorthand of social services emergency protocols, arranging home evaluations and reference checks with the efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes bureaucracy needed to bend in service of human need.
2 hours later, Harold found himself standing in his apartment's doorway with 2 small boys and enough emergency supplies to sustain them through their first night in yet another unfamiliar place. Carmen had greeted the news of temporary house guests with a kind of enthusiastic hospitality that made Harold proud of the daughter he and Maria had raised together. "This is my room," Carmen announced, giving Alex and Danny a comprehensive tour that included explanations of her stuffed animal hierarchy and the proper method of avoiding the squeaky floorboard outside the bathroom. "Dad says you can sleep in here tonight, and tomorrow we'll set up the other room properly." The boys followed her with careful attention, clearly overwhelmed by the day's events, but responding to Carmen's natural warmth with the resilience that children possessed when treated with genuine kindness. Harold watched from the hallway, marveling at how quickly his small family had expanded to accommodate 2 more members, how naturally his daughter had assumed the role of big sister, despite being the same age as her new house guests. Mrs. Gonzalez appeared with a casserole dish and maternal efficiency that brooked no argument. "These boys need proper food and rest, and you need to call your supervisor about taking emergency leave."
As evening descended over Millbrook Heights, Harold found himself presiding over a dinner table that suddenly felt exactly the right size. Alex and Danny ate with the careful politeness of children who weren't sure what was expected of them, while Carmen chattered about school and friends and the various adventures they could have together if the boys decided to stay longer than just a few days. "Will our dad come get us soon?" Danny asked quietly, his fork pushing mashed potatoes around his plate in patterns that suggested his appetite hadn't yet returned. "I hope so," Harold replied honestly. "But until he does, you're safe here. Sometimes that's all we can control, making sure the people we care about are safe today." The words felt true as he spoke them, carrying lessons he'd learned during his own navigation of sudden loss and unwanted responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: contact with the boy's father, arrangements for school enrollment, the complex logistics of temporary guardianship. But tonight, as he listened to 3 children plan elaborate games and negotiate bedtime routines, Harold realized that his carefully controlled life had just become something larger and more complicated and possibly more meaningful than anything he'd allowed himself to hope for since Maria's death. The Sterling boys had lost their mother in Clearwater Creek, but they'd also gained something Harold was only beginning to understand: a place where broken families could learn to heal together, where tragedy could become the foundation for unexpected grace. 3 weeks had passed since Alex and Danny Sterling moved into Harold's apartment, and the transformation of their small space had been nothing short of miraculous. What had once been a storage room filled with Maria's belongings had become a proper bedroom, complete with twin beds that Harold had found at a thrift store and painted bright blue at Carmen's insistence. The boys' few possessions from their previous life, clothes retrieved from their mother's house, some books, a stuffed elephant that Danny clutched during nightmares, had found homes among the controlled chaos of a household that had doubled in size overnight. Harold had taken emergency leave from the automotive plant, using vacation days he'd been hoarding for years to navigate the complex logistics of sudden guardianship. Phone calls with lawyers, meetings with school administrators, video conferences with Dr. Sterling's colleagues who were helping coordinate the search for the boy's father. Each day brought new administrative challenges that Harold tackled with the same methodical determination he'd once applied to assembly line work. But it was the small moments that surprised him most. The way Alex had appointed himself Carmen's unofficial protector, walking her to the school bus each morning with the serious responsibility of someone who understood that safety wasn't guaranteed. How Danny had begun helping Mrs. Gonzalez in her small garden plot, his gentle touch with seedlings revealed an intuitive understanding of growing things that reminded Harold painfully of Maria's own green thumb. The morning routine had evolved to accommodate 3 children instead of 1, a carefully choreographed dance of shared bathroom time, breakfast preparation, and backpack organization that somehow worked despite the cramped quarters. Carmen had embraced her role as big sister with enthusiasm that both warmed Harold's heart and occasionally exhausted him, her natural leadership skills emerging as she helped the twins navigate everything from cafeteria procedures to playground politics. "Dad," Carmen announced over breakfast one Friday morning, her tone carrying the serious weight she reserved for important proclamations. "Alex and Danny should stay with us forever. They're good at sharing, they help clean up without being asked, and Danny knows all the words to the songs from Frozen." Alex looked up from his cereal with the careful hope that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Would that be okay? If we stayed, I mean. Even after our dad comes back?" Harold felt something tighten in his chest at the question. The boy's father remained unreachable despite increasingly urgent efforts from both the American Embassy and Dr. Sterling's legal team. Business associates in Europe confirmed that James Sterling was indeed traveling for medical conference presentations, but his exact location seemed to shift daily as he moved between cities for speaking engagements and research meetings. "That would be up to your father," Harold replied gently. Although privately I'd begun to dread the phone call that would eventually come, summoning Alex and Danny back to a life he was only beginning to understand through fragments of overheard conversations and legal documents. Dr. Victoria Sterling had been a single mother by choice, having adopted the twins as infants through a private agency after her divorce from James Sterling 3 years earlier. The custody arrangement was complicated. James had maintained parental rights but had agreed that Victoria would serve as primary guardian while he focused on establishing his medical practice on the West Coast. Now, with Victoria gone, the legal framework for the boy's future remained unclear, dependent on decisions that a father they barely knew would need to make about children he'd seen only during holiday visits and summer vacations.
The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Patricia Wells, a family court advocate who'd been assigned to represent Alex and Danny's interests during the guardianship proceedings. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who carried herself with the no-nonsense authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic complications to focus on what actually mattered for the children involved. "Mr. Ruiz," she said, settling into Harold's living room with a legal pad and the kind of thorough attention that suggested this wasn't a routine visit. "I've been reviewing the boys' case, and I wanted to discuss some concerns about their long-term placement." Harold felt his stomach drop, though he kept his expression neutral as Carmen and the twins continued their homework session at the kitchen table. "What kind of concerns?" "James Sterling is a successful physician, but his work requires extensive travel and irregular hours. His contact history with the boys has been minimal since the divorce, and according to Dr. Sterling's notes, he'd expressed doubts about his readiness for full-time parenting even before this tragedy occurred." Patricia consulted her notes, her voice maintaining the careful neutrality required in family court proceedings. "The boys have clearly bonded with your family. Their school counselor reports significant improvement in their emotional adjustment over the past 3 weeks. They're sleeping better, participating in class activities, and showing signs of genuine healing rather than just coping." "But they belong with their father," Harold said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Blood family should come first." "Should it?" Patricia asked, raising an eyebrow with the kind of pointed question that suggested she'd seen enough family situations to know that biology didn't automatically guarantee the best outcomes for children. "Legal parentage creates rights and responsibilities, Mr. Ruiz, but it doesn't automatically create the kind of home environment that helps traumatized children heal." Through the kitchen doorway, Harold could see Alex helping Danny with his math homework, while Carmen was working on a social studies project that somehow required input from all 3 children. Their collaboration was natural and supportive, the kind of sibling dynamic that typically took years to develop, but had emerged organically in their household within weeks. "What are you suggesting?" Harold asked, though he suspected he already knew where this conversation was heading. "I'm suggesting that when James Sterling finally contacts us, we need to be prepared to advocate for what's genuinely best for Alex and Danny, not just what's legally straightforward. These boys have experienced profound trauma, and they're finally in a stable environment where they're beginning to heal. Disrupting that progress to satisfy legal technicalities could cause additional psychological damage. Patricia pulled out a manila folder containing what appeared to be psychological evaluations and school reports. Dr. Martinez has been working with the boys since the accident. His assessment indicates that while they're processing their grief in healthy ways, they're also demonstrating significant attachment anxiety about potential future separations. They've lost their mother, and now they're terrified of losing the new family structure they've found here. Harold thought about the nightmares that still woke Danny most evenings, how the boy would appear in Harold's bedroom doorway asking for reassurance that everyone was still safe, still there. Alex had developed a habit of checking on Carmen before bedtime, his protective instincts extending to the sister he'd gained through tragedy rather than birth. The legal system moves slowly, which gives us time to build a case for what's genuinely in the boys' best interests. James Sterling may decide that his lifestyle isn't compatible with full-time single parenthood, or he may choose to relocate them to Seattle, separating them from the only stability they've known since their mother's death. The possibility of losing Alex and Danny hit Harold with unexpected force. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd somehow stopped thinking of them as temporary house guests and started seeing them as simply part of his family. The apartment felt exactly the right size with 4 people sharing its small spaces. Dinner conversations had become livelier and more complex. Even his own grief over Maria's death had shifted slightly, transformed from a burden he carried alone into something that could be shared and gradually lightened through the simple act of caring for others who understood loss. "What would you need from me?" Harold asked, making a decision that surprised him with its certainty. If James Sterling agrees to let them stay, what would the legal process involve? Patricia smiled for the first time since entering his apartment. Adoption proceedings, if he's willing to terminate his parental rights, or long-term guardianship if he prefers to maintain legal parentage while delegating daily responsibilities. Either way, you'd need to demonstrate financial stability, pass home evaluations, complete parenting classes, submit to background checks. "I can do all that," Harold said immediately, then paused as the full implications hit him. "But I'd need to find better work. The plant doesn't pay enough to support 4 people long-term, and I'd need better health insurance, college savings accounts, all the things that growing children require." "One step at a time," Patricia advised. "First, we need to hear from James Sterling. Then we can discuss practical arrangements if he's open to alternative custody solutions." That evening, as Harold tucked 3 children into their respective beds and listened to the comfortable sounds of a house settling around a family larger than he'd ever imagined possible, he found himself hoping for something he'd been afraid to want. Not just that Alex and Danny could stay, but that their father would recognize what Harold was only beginning to understand, that families weren't just biological connections, but the relationships people chose to nurture and protect and build together, one ordinary day at a time. The phone call from James Sterling would come eventually, bringing decisions that would reshape all their lives. But tonight, with 3 children safe under his roof and Mrs. Gonzalez's laughter drifting up from the apartment below, Harold allowed himself to imagine a future where broken families could be rebuilt into something stronger than what they'd lost, where love could grow from tragedy into something beautiful enough to last forever. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in early November, just as Harold was helping Alex with a science project about the water cycle that had somehow evolved into an elaborate diorama involving cotton ball clouds and blue food coloring. Carmen and Danny were sprawled on the living room floor, working on a collaborative art project that appeared to be part family portrait, part fantasy landscape, their heads bent together in the concentrated silence that marked serious creative work. Harold almost didn't answer when his phone rang with an unknown number, but something about the timing, just after dinner when most business calls would have ended for the day, made him reach for the device with a sense of inevitability that had been building for weeks. "Is this Harold Ruiz?" The voice was crisp and professional, carrying the slight distortion that suggested an international connection. "This is Dr. James Sterling. I believe you've been caring for my sons." The conversation that followed unfolded with the surreal quality of a long-anticipated moment finally arriving, bringing with it all the complications Harold had been dreading since the first night Alex and Danny had slept in his apartment. James Sterling was calling from Vienna, where he'd finally received the accumulated messages about Victoria's death and his son's placement in emergency foster care. "I've been traveling for 6 weeks," James explained, his voice carrying exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. Medical conferences, research presentations, collaboration meetings with European colleagues. I kept my phone off for days at a time to focus on the work. I had no idea about the accident until I checked my messages yesterday. Harold stepped into his bedroom, closing the door to give the children privacy while they continued their evening activities. Through the thin walls, he could hear Carmen explaining color theory to Danny with the patient authority of someone who'd appointed herself the household's art instructor. "The boys have been through a lot," Harold said carefully, unsure how much detail to share about Alex's nightmares or Danny's lingering anxiety about car rides, or the way both children had begun referring to Carmen as their sister without any apparent awareness that the designation wasn't legally accurate. "I'm sure they have." James's voice carried genuine concern, but also a quality of distance that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of what had changed in his absence. "The social worker I spoke with, Patricia Wells, she indicated that they've been staying with you since the accident. That's extremely generous, Mr. Ruiz. I can't imagine what kind of burden that's placed on your family." The word burden settled uncomfortably in Harold's chest. Alex and Danny never felt like a burden, despite the financial strain and logistical complications their presence had created. If anything, they'd brought an energy and purpose to his household that Harold hadn't realized he'd been missing since Maria's death. "They're good kids," Harold replied. "They've been dealing with their grief, but they're resilient, and they've bonded well with my daughter Carmen." "I'll need to make arrangements to come get them as soon as possible," James continued, his tone shifting into the kind of problem-solving mode that Harold recognized from his own experience managing crisis situations. "Probably within the next week or two, once I can reorganize my schedule and book flights back to the States." The casual way James discussed uprooting Alex and Danny from the only stability they'd known since their mother's death sent alarm bells through Harold's mind. These weren't pieces of luggage that could be moved according to adult convenience. They were traumatized children who had begun to heal in an environment where they felt safe and valued. "Dr. Sterling," Harold said, choosing his words carefully, "I don't know if Patricia Wells mentioned this, but the boys have been doing really well here. They're enrolled in the local elementary school, they've made friends, they're seeing a counselor who specializes in childhood grief. Moving them again so soon after losing their mother might be more disruptive than beneficial." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Harold to wonder if the international connection had been lost. When James finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less certain, more vulnerable. "Mr. Ruiz, I need to be honest with you about something. Victoria and I divorced 3 years ago because I wasn't ready to be a full-time parent. The boys were 5 when she adopted them, and I tried to embrace fatherhood, but my work demands made it impossible to be the kind of present, consistent father they needed. Victoria was better at it, more patient, more intuitive about their emotional needs." Harold found himself thinking about his own learning curve with Carmen after Maria's death, how single parenthood had forced him to develop skills and instincts he'd never known he possessed. "Parenting is something you learn by doing," he offered. "It doesn't come naturally to everyone right away." "That's kind of you to say, but the truth is more complicated." James's voice carried the weight of someone making a difficult confession. "My current life isn't set up for children. I travel internationally at least twice a month. I work 60-hour weeks when I'm home. I live in a one-bedroom apartment because I'm rarely there long enough to justify anything larger. Taking the boys would mean completely restructuring my career and lifestyle, and I'm not sure I'm prepared for that level of change." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Harold was afraid to hope for but couldn't ignore. "What are you saying, exactly?" "I'm saying that maybe we should explore alternatives," James replied. "Patricia Wells mentioned that you might be interested in a more permanent arrangement. Is that accurate?" Harold looked through his bedroom door toward the living room where 3 children were now collaborating on what appeared to be an architectural project involving blocks, books, and Carmen's entire collection of stuffed animals. Alex was serving as chief engineer, Danny was providing creative input about color coordination, and Carmen was mediating disputes with the diplomatic skills of someone who'd learned to navigate competing personalities. "Yes," Harold said, the word carrying more certainty than he'd felt about any decision since Maria's death. "I'd be very interested in that possibility." The conversation that followed covered practical considerations that would need to be addressed, legal procedures for transferring guardianship, financial arrangements that would ensure the boys' needs were met, visitation schedules that would allow James to maintain a relationship with his sons without the full responsibilities of primary parenting. "There's something else you should know," James said as their discussion began to wind down. Victoria had a life insurance policy, and she'd set up education funds for both boys. If you were to become their legal guardian, you'd have access to those resources for their care and schooling. She wanted to make sure they'd be provided for, regardless of what happened to her. The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. Harold had been prepared to stretch his modest factory worker salary to accommodate 2 additional children, accepting the financial challenges as part of the commitment he was making. Learning that Victoria had already arranged for her son's financial security felt like a gift from someone he'd never met, but who'd shared his understanding that children deserved stability above all else. "I'd want to meet you in person before making any final decisions. And I'd want to spend some time with Alex and Danny to make sure they're truly comfortable with this arrangement. But if everyone agrees that this is what's best for them, I think we could make it work." When Harold emerged from his bedroom 20 minutes later, 3 pairs of eyes looked up at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. Children were remarkably adept at sensing when adult conversations carried significance that might affect their lives. "Was that our dad?" Alex asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested he was prepared for whatever answer Harold might give. "Yes," Harold replied, settling onto the couch so he could look at all 3 children directly. "He's coming to visit in a couple of weeks. He wants to talk with you about what you'd like your future to look like." "Are we going to have to leave?" Danny asked, his lower lip trembling slightly with the vulnerability that still surfaced whenever the subject of separation arose. Pulling both boys closer, including Carmen in the embrace that had become their family's standard response to difficult conversations, Harold said, "That's something we'll all decide together, but I want you to know that whatever happens, you'll always have a place here with us. Always." The relief that crossed both boys' faces told Harold everything he needed to know about the decision he was preparing to make. Some families were born, others were chosen, and still others were forged in the crucible of shared loss and mutual healing. Whatever legal arrangements emerged from the coming weeks, Harold understood that Alex and Danny Sterling had already become his sons in every way that mattered, just as Carmen had become their sister through the simple act of opening their hearts to children who needed a place to belong. James Sterling arrived in Millbrook Heights on a gray December afternoon that carried the promise of the season's first snow. Harold watched from his apartment window as a black sedan pulled up outside their building, its pristine surface and rental car plates marking it as distinctly foreign to their neighborhood of weathered trucks and practical economy vehicles. The man who emerged was tall and lean, dressed in the kind of expensive casual wear that spoke of professional success and careful attention to appearance. Harold had spent the past 2 weeks preparing Alex and Danny for their father's visit, though he wasn't entirely sure how to ready 2 7-year-old boys for a conversation that would determine the trajectory of their entire childhood. The twins had responded with the kind of nervous excitement that children displayed when facing significant unknowns.
alternately asking detailed questions about their father's appearance and interests, then retreating into worried silence about what his arrival might mean for their newly stable world. Carmen had appointed herself the family's diplomatic coordinator, spending hours coaching Alex and Danny on proper guest behavior while simultaneously planning an elaborate welcome dinner that would showcase their household's warmth and functionality. Her natural leadership skills had evolved over the past months into something approaching maternal protectiveness over the boys she'd claimed as brothers, and Harold could see her anxiety about this visit in the way she'd reorganized their shared bedroom 3 times in the past week. The knock on the door came precisely at the appointed time, carrying the punctuality that Harold had learned to associate with medical professionals and business executives. When he opened it, James Sterling stood in the hallway with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone encountering a reality that differed significantly from his expectations. "Mr. Ruiz," James said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know the circumstances are complicated." Harold invited him in, noting how James's gaze swept the small apartment with careful assessment. The space was clean and organized, but there was no hiding its modest proportions or the creative solutions they'd developed for accommodating 4 people in quarters designed for 2. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, homework assignments were spread across the kitchen table, and the living room showed evidence of the controlled chaos that marked households where learning and play happened simultaneously. "Dad, is that him?" Carmen's voice carried from the bedroom, followed by urgent whispered consultations between all 3 children. Harold could hear Danny asking if they should come out now or wait to be introduced, and Alex providing authoritative guidance based on his superior knowledge of adult social protocols. "They're nervous," Harold explained, though Harold probably didn't need the clarification. "This is a big moment for them." James nodded, his expression softening slightly as the reality of his son's emotional investment in this visit became apparent. "I'm nervous too, honestly. It's been 6 months since I've seen them, and even longer since we've had any meaningful time together." The children emerged from the bedroom with the careful coordination of a diplomatic delegation. Carmen led the way, followed by Alex and Danny, who stayed close enough to each other to provide mutual support while maintaining the polite distance appropriate for greeting a relative they barely knew. Harold felt pride swell in his chest at their composure, their obvious effort to make a good impression despite their underlying anxiety. "Hello, boys," James said, crouching down to their eye level with the kind of deliberate gesture that suggested he'd read books about connecting with children. "You've gotten so tall since I saw you last summer." "Hello, Dr. Sterling," Alex replied formally, his response carrying the careful politeness that emerged when he was uncertain about social expectations. Danny nodded but remained silent, stepping slightly behind his brother in a pattern Harold had learned to recognize as his standard response to unfamiliar adults. Carmen, never one to let awkward silences persist, stepped forward with the confidence of someone representing their household's interests. "I'm Carmen Ruiz. Alex and Danny are my brothers now, and we made you a welcome dinner with all their favorite foods." The word brothers hung in the air with significance that wasn't lost on anyone present. Harold watched James process this declaration, seeing the mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief cross his features. Whatever James had expected to find in Millbrook Heights, it clearly wasn't 3 children who'd formed genuine sibling bonds or a household that functioned with the easy cooperation he was witnessing. The dinner that followed was both awkward and revealing, marked by Carmen's determined efforts to showcase their family dynamics, while Alex and Danny navigated the complex emotional territory of reconnecting with a father who'd become more absence than presence in their lives. James asked careful questions about school and friends and favorite activities, receiving polite answers that carried little of the animated enthusiasm the boys typically showed when discussing their daily adventures. "Alex helps me with my math homework," Carmen reported during dessert, apparently deciding that her brothers needed assistance in demonstrating their positive qualities. "And Danny knows all about plants because he helps Mrs. Gonzalez with her garden. They're really good at sharing and cleaning up, and they never fight except when Danny tries to put ketchup on everything." I could see James struggling to reconcile the children Carmen described with his own limited experience of Alex and Danny as occasional weekend visitors who'd seemed more interested in video games and avoiding conversation than in domestic cooperation or academic achievement. The children sitting at Harold's kitchen table were more confident, more articulate, more integrated into family life than the children James remembered from his sporadic custody visits. After dinner, while the children worked on homework in the living room,
Harold and James sat in the kitchen over coffee that had grown cold while they navigated a conversation neither had experience handling. The practical details of potential guardianship transfer had been outlined during their phone discussions, but the emotional complexities of such an arrangement required in-person exploration.
"They seem happy here," James observed, watching through the doorway as Alex helped Danny with a reading assignment while Carmen worked on a science project that appeared to require significant collaboration. More settled than I've ever seen them, honestly. Harold followed his gaze, seeing his household through James's eyes, the easy way the children moved around each other, the natural division of responsibilities, the comfortable assumption that help would be available when needed. They've been through a lot, but kids are resilient when they feel secure. "Victoria always said I wasn't built for day-to-day parenting," James continued, his voice carrying the weight of an admission he'd clearly been considering throughout the visit. "She was right. I love the boys, but I love them better from a distance where I can be the fun uncle figure rather than the person responsible for homework and discipline and medical appointments." The honesty was both refreshing and heartbreaking. Harold could see the genuine care in James's expression when he looked at Alex and Danny, but also the relief of someone who'd been dreading responsibilities he wasn't equipped to handle. "There's no shame in recognizing your limitations," Harold offered. "The boys need someone who can be present consistently, not someone who feels obligated to restructure their entire life around parenthood." James pulled out a manila folder containing legal documents that Patricia Wells had prepared for their review. "If you're still willing to proceed with guardianship transfer, I'd like to make this as smooth as possible for everyone involved. Full legal adoption, if you're comfortable with that level of commitment, with visitation rights that let me maintain a relationship with them without the pressure of primary responsibility." "I'd be honored to adopt them," Harold said, meaning it completely. "They're already my sons in every way that matters." The conversation that followed covered practical arrangements, financial support, medical decisions, educational planning, holiday visitation schedules, with the kind of collaborative problem-solving that suggested both men were focused on the boys' best interests rather than their own emotional needs. James would establish trust funds for Alex and Danny's future education, maintain health insurance coverage, and visit quarterly to preserve their father-son relationship within boundaries that acknowledged Harold as their primary parent. When they called the children into the kitchen to explain the decisions that had been reached, Harold watched Alex and Danny process the news with expressions that cycled through surprise, relief, and something that looked like cautious joy. Carmen's response was immediate and emphatic, a whoop of celebration that probably woke half the building, followed by a group hug that somehow managed to include all 5 people present. "So we can stay forever?" Danny asked, his voice small but hopeful. "Even when we grow up and go to college and get married and have kids of our own? This is your home, for as long as you want it to be." Harold stayed for 3 more days, spending time with Alex and Danny individually and together, building memories that would sustain their relationship during the months between visits. When he finally left for the airport, his goodbyes carried the weight of someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision and found unexpected relief in discovering that his sons would be loved and cared for by someone better suited to the daily demands of parenthood. That evening, as Harold tucked 3 children into their beds and listened to their excited planning for the Christmas they would spend together as an officially recognized family, Harold understood that some of life's most important moments arrived disguised as endings rather than beginnings. James Sterling's departure marked the conclusion of Alex and Danny's uncertain legal status, but it also marked the beginning of something Harold had never dared to hope for: a family rebuilt from loss into something stronger and more beautiful than what any of them had imagined possible. The adoption proceedings began in earnest after the new year, transforming Harold's carefully ordered life into a series of appointments, evaluations, and interviews that felt both invasive and necessary.
Patricia Wells had warned him that the legal system moved with deliberate caution when it came to permanent custody arrangements, but Harold hadn't anticipated the emotional toll of having his fitness as a parent scrutinized by strangers who reduced his relationship with Alex and Danny to checkboxes on institutional forms. The home study conducted by the Department of Children and Family Services was particularly challenging, requiring Harold to account for every aspect of his living situation, while 3 social workers took notes about everything from his kitchen organization to the children's sleeping arrangements. Alex and Danny handled the interviews with remarkable composure, answering questions about their daily routines and emotional well-being with the kind of thoughtful responses that clearly impressed the evaluators, though Harold could see the stress of being examined affecting both boys in subtle ways.
Carmen appointed herself the family's unofficial spokesperson during these visits, providing comprehensive tours of their apartment and detailed explanations of their household rules and traditions, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that their living situation was perfectly normal and functional. Her natural warmth and obvious pride in her expanded family seemed to reassure the social workers more than any formal documentation could have accomplished. The financial evaluation proved more challenging than Harold had expected. While James Sterling's commitment to ongoing support and Victoria's life insurance provisions ensured that Alex and Danny's immediate needs would be met, the adoption agency required detailed projections of long-term expenses, including college costs, medical emergencies, and other contingencies that stretched far beyond Harold's experience with budgeting and financial planning. "You'll need to demonstrate stable employment that can support a family of 4, explained Margaret Chen, the adoption coordinator assigned to their case. "The automotive plant position provides steady income, but the salary levels may not meet our requirements for a household with 3 children, especially considering future educational expenses." The conversation took place in Margaret's office at the county courthouse, a sterile environment that made Harold feel like he was defending his worthiness rather than formalizing his commitment to children who'd already been living as his sons for months. Through the window, he could see Millbrook Heights spread out below, the industrial landscape that had provided employment for 3 generations of his family, but that suddenly seemed inadequate for the future he was trying to build. "What kind of income requirements are we talking about?" Harold asked, though he suspected the answer would force him to confront decisions he'd been avoiding since James Sterling's visit. Margaret consulted her files with the kind of thorough attention that suggested she'd delivered similar news to other hopeful parents. "For a family of 4 in this region, we typically require documentation of annual income at least 20% above the federal poverty line, with additional provisions for emergency savings and educational funding. Your current salary falls approximately 15% below our recommended threshold." The numbers hit Harold like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they quantified the gap between his desire to provide for Alex and Danny and his actual capacity to meet their long-term needs. Factory work had sustained him and Carmen adequately, but adding 2 more children to their household created financial pressures that his current employment simply couldn't address. "I could take on additional shifts," Harold offered, though he knew that working more hours would mean less time with the children who needed his presence more than his paycheck. "Or find part-time evening work to supplement my income." "Mr. Ruiz," Margaret said gently, "the issue isn't just current income levels. The boys will need resources for extracurricular activities, educational support, medical care, and eventually college preparation. Victoria Sterling was a successful physician who could provide those opportunities. We need to ensure that their adoptive family can maintain similar standards." The implications stung, though Harold recognized the logic behind the agency's concerns. Alex and Danny deserved every advantage their adoptive mother had planned to provide, and Harold's working-class background shouldn't limit their future opportunities simply because he loved them and wanted to keep them safe. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with employment websites open on his laptop, searching for positions that might bridge the gap between his current skills and the income requirements the adoption agency had outlined. Manufacturing jobs with higher pay scales required technical certifications he didn't possess. Administrative positions demanded college degrees he'd never pursued. Management roles in his industry were rare and typically filled through internal promotions that could take years to achieve. The children sensed his preoccupation during dinner, their usual animated conversation giving way to concerned glances and careful questions about whether everything was okay. Harold tried to maintain his normal demeanor, but the weight of potentially failing them pressed against his chest like a physical burden he couldn't dislodge. "Dad," Carmen said as they cleaned up after dinner, using the tone she reserved for serious conversations, "are Alex and Danny going to have to leave because of money?" The directness of her question caught Harold off guard, though he should have expected that his daughter would identify the source of his anxiety with the perceptive accuracy she'd inherited from Maria. "I'm trying to figure out how to make sure they can stay," he replied honestly. "Sometimes that means making changes to provide better opportunities for everyone." Alex appeared in the kitchen doorway, clearly having overheard part of their conversation. "We don't need expensive things," he said earnestly. "We just need to stay together. Danny and I talked about it, and we'd rather live here with less money than anywhere else with more money." The simple clarity of Alex's statement made Harold's throat tight with emotion. These children had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond their control, and now they faced the possibility of losing their chosen family because of economic realities that felt equally insurmountable.
"Sometimes what we want and what's possible aren't the same thing," Harold said, hating himself for introducing adult complexity into his children's world. "But I promise you that I'm going to do everything I can to make this work." The solution, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. Mrs. Gonzalez knocked on their door the following evening with her usual maternal authority, carrying a plate of fresh empanadas and the kind of determined expression that suggested she had important business to discuss. "Harold?" she said, settling into his living room with the confidence of someone who had been part of their household's extended family since Maria's death. "My nephew Roberto works in the medical device manufacturing plant across town. They're hiring supervisors, and the pay is almost double what you make at the automotive factory." Harold looked up from the homework help session he'd been providing to Danny, his attention suddenly focused with laser intensity. "What kind of supervisors?" "Floor management, quality control, training coordination," Mrs. Gonzalez continued. "Roberto says they prefer candidates with manufacturing experience, but they provide all the technical training. The company is expanding because of new government contracts, and they need people who understand both production processes and worker safety." The possibility felt too good to be real, but Harold found himself calculating numbers in his head: mortgage payments, food costs, educational expenses, and the adoption agency's income requirements. Even with his limited understanding of medical device manufacturing, the salary range Mrs. Gonzalez described would place their family comfortably above the financial thresholds that had seemed impossibly high just days earlier. "Would you be willing to put in a good word for me?" Harold asked, feeling hope bloom in his chest for the first time since his meeting with Margaret Chen. "Already did," Mrs. Gonzalez replied, with a satisfied smile. "Roberto talked to his supervisor and they want to interview you next week. Apparently, single fathers with manufacturing experience and good references are exactly what they're looking for. People who understand responsibility and aren't likely to job hop for small increases in pay." The interview process that followed was intensive but encouraging, involving practical assessments of Harold's technical knowledge, leadership potential, and ability to manage complex production schedules while maintaining safety standards. The plant manufactured surgical instruments and diagnostic equipment, requiring precision and attention to detail that drew directly on Harold's skills he had developed during his years in automotive assembly. More importantly,
The company culture emphasized work-life balance and family stability, offering flexible scheduling for parents and comprehensive benefits packages that included educational assistance for employees' children. The hiring manager, a woman named Diana Martinez, who'd built her own career while raising 3 sons, seemed genuinely interested in Harold's situation and impressed by his commitment to providing for his adopted children. "We value employees who understand that good work comes from people who have stable home lives. Your references describe you as reliable, skilled, and someone who takes responsibility seriously. Those are exactly the qualities we need in a supervisor position." The job offer came through on a Friday afternoon, accompanied by a salary figure that exceeded Harold's most optimistic projections and benefits documentation that addressed virtually every concern the adoption agency had raised about long-term financial stability. When he called Margaret Chen to update her on his employment status, the relief in her voice was audible even through the phone's compressed audio. "This changes everything, Mr. Ruiz. With this income level and benefits package, we can move forward with the adoption proceedings immediately. The boys should be legally yours within 60 days. That evening's celebration dinner was the loudest and most chaotic meal their household had ever shared, with all 3 children talking simultaneously about their plans for the future now that their family's permanence was assured. Carmen announced her intention to teach Alex and Danny everything she knew about managing household responsibilities. Alex declared that he would help Harold learn his new job by practicing supervisor skills at home. Danny quietly asked if this meant they could get a pet, since they'd have more money for veterinary expenses. As Harold listened to their excited planning and watched the relief transform their faces from careful hope to genuine joy, he understood that the past months had been about more than legal proceedings and financial requirements. They'd been about learning that families weren't just biological accidents or legal arrangements, but conscious choices made daily through acts of love, sacrifice, and mutual commitment.
The job at the medical device plant would begin in 2 weeks, giving Harold time to complete his transition from the automotive factory and adjust to responsibilities that felt both daunting and exactly right for the future he was building. But tonight, surrounded by 3 children who called him Dad and trusted him to keep them safe and together, Harold felt the deep satisfaction that came from choosing correctly when life offered impossible decisions. Some victories required more than just wanting them enough. They demanded the courage to change everything you thought you knew about yourself in service of love that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful enough to last forever. 5 years had passed since the adoption papers were signed in Judge Morrison's chambers, transforming Harold Ruiz from a struggling single father into the legal guardian of 3 children who'd found their way to each other through circumstances none of them could have imagined. The small apartment above the corner deli had given way to a modest house on Maple Street, complete with a backyard where Mrs. Gonzalez's gardening wisdom had taken root in raised beds that produced enough vegetables to share with half the neighborhood. Harold stood in his kitchen on a Saturday morning in late spring, watching through the window as 12-year-old Carmen supervised Alex and Danny in what appeared to be an elaborate science experiment involving baking soda volcanoes and careful measurements that would have made their 7th-grade chemistry teacher proud. The boys had grown tall and confident, their shared trauma from that night at Clearwater Creek now integrated into family stories that honored their mother's memory while celebrating the life they'd built together. The medical device manufacturing plant had exceeded Harold's expectations in every measurable way. His promotion to senior supervisor had come with increased responsibilities and compensation that allowed him to establish college funds for all 3 children, purchase reliable vehicles, and even begin saving for the family vacation to Yellowstone that Carmen had been planning with military precision for the past 6 months. More importantly, the work felt meaningful in ways that assembly line production never had, contributing to medical innovations that helped surgeons save lives and patients recover from injuries that might once have been permanent. Diana Martinez had become both mentor and friend over the years, recognizing Harold's natural leadership abilities and encouraging him to pursue additional training that positioned him for future advancement within the company.
The professional development courses he attended during evening hours had rekindled an intellectual curiosity that Harold hadn't experienced since high school, opening possibilities for career growth that extended far beyond his original expectations. The house itself reflected the family's evolution from survival mode to genuine prosperity. Carmen's artwork covered the walls alongside school photos that documented their growth from tentative strangers to siblings who argued about bathroom time and collaborated on elaborate pranks against their father. Alex had developed an interest in engineering that manifested in increasingly complex construction projects using recycled materials and careful planning. Danny's gentle nature had flourished in the stability of their household, expressing itself through poetry and music that surprised teachers who remembered his initial shyness. James Sterling had maintained his quarterly visits with reliable consistency, establishing a relationship with Alex and Danny that honored their biological connection while respecting Harold's role as their primary parent. The boys called him Uncle James now, a designation that felt appropriate for someone who provided interesting stories about his medical research adventures and thoughtful gifts on birthdays and holidays, but who clearly understood that Harold was their father in every way that mattered for daily life. The financial security that had once seemed impossible now felt natural and well-earned. Harold's salary increases had been accompanied by bonuses based on production efficiency improvements and safety innovations he'd implemented on the manufacturing floor. The life insurance policy he'd been able to afford provided peace of mind about his children's future security, while the college savings accounts grew steadily toward their eventual educational expenses. But the most significant changes were emotional rather than financial. Harold had learned to accept help when it was offered, building relationships with other parents at school events and neighborhood gatherings that created a support network extending far beyond Mrs. Gonzalez's maternal supervision. Carmen's teacher conferences now included discussions about her leadership potential and academic achievements rather than concerns about her emotional adjustment to family disruption. Alex and Danny participated in Little League baseball and school science fairs with the confident assumption that their father would be present for every game and presentation. The anniversary of Victoria Sterling's death had become a day of remembrance rather than trauma, marked by visits to her grave where the children left flowers and shared updates about their accomplishments and future plans. They spoke to her as if she were present, telling her about Carmen's acceptance into the advanced mathematics program and Alex's winning entry in the regional engineering competition, and Danny's selection for the school chorus that would perform at the state capitol. Harold had framed one of Victoria's sketches, not the one from her Driftwood journal, which remained private, but a simple drawing of Clearwater Creek during peaceful weather that Alex had found among her belongings. It hung in their living room beside family photos that included James Sterling during his visits, creating a visual narrative that honored their complex history while celebrating their chosen connections.
The community had embraced their unconventional family structure with the kind of practical acceptance that characterized small industrial towns where people judged each other based on reliability and kindness rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Harold served on the school board now, advocating for programs that supported working families and children who'd experienced trauma. His perspective, as someone who'd navigated both financial struggle and family reconstruction, brought valuable insights to policy discussions about educational equity and mental health resources. Mrs. Gonzalez had moved into the apartment below theirs when her arthritis made climbing stairs difficult, accepting Harold's invitation to join their household as extended family rather than just helpful neighbor. Her presence provided continuity with their earlier years while adding another layer of stability and wisdom to their daily routines. The children called her Abuela and included her in all major decisions about holiday celebrations and vacation planning. On this particular Saturday morning, Harold found himself thinking about Maria more than he had in months, not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with gentle gratitude for the parenting foundation she'd provided during Carmen's earliest years. His daughter had inherited Maria's artistic sensibility and social confidence, but she'd also developed Harold's practical problem-solving skills and his instinct for protecting people who needed advocacy or support. The doorbell interrupted his reflections, announcing the arrival of Patricia Wells, who'd remained involved in their lives long after the legal proceedings concluded. She visited periodically to check on the family's adjustment and to gather information for research about successful adoption outcomes that might inform future policy recommendations. "Harold," Patricia said, accepting the coffee he offered while settling into the kitchen chair that had become her designated spot during these informal follow-up visits. "The children look wonderful. Carmen's grown at least 2 inches since I saw her last fall." Through the window, they could see the 3 children now engaged in what appeared to be a competitive engineering challenge involving water balloons and structural reinforcement techniques that would probably result in everyone getting thoroughly soaked. Their laughter carried clearly through the glass, punctuated by Carmen's authoritative instructions about proper experimental methodology. "They're thriving," Harold agreed, meaning it completely. "All 3 of them. Sometimes I can't believe how far we've all come since that night at the creek." Patricia nodded, making notes in the file folder she'd brought for documenting their family's continued success. "Your case has become something of a model for our department. Single-parent adoption of siblings, cross-racial family formation, successful integration of children with trauma histories. You've managed to navigate challenges that defeat many families with more resources and traditional support systems." The recognition felt good, though Harold understood that their success hadn't been guaranteed or easily achieved. It had required daily choices to prioritize the children's needs above his own comfort, consistent effort to build trust and communication, and willingness to seek help when his own experience proved inadequate for the challenges they faced. "What made the difference?" Patricia asked, the question she posed during each visit, as part of her ongoing research into factors that predicted positive adoption outcomes. Harold considered his answer while watching Alex demonstrate proper volcano construction techniques to his younger brother with the patient instruction that had become characteristic of their sibling relationships. "Love helps, but love isn't enough by itself. You need stability, resources, community support, and the willingness to change your entire life around what children need rather than what adults want." The conversation continued for another hour, covering the children's academic progress, their social development, their ongoing relationship with James Sterling, and Harold's own adjustment to his expanded family responsibilities. When Patricia finally left, she carried with her documentation of another successful placement that would influence policy decisions affecting future families navigating similar circumstances. That evening, as Harold tucked 3 nearly teenage children into beds they'd outgrown but weren't quite ready to abandon, Harold reflected on the unexpected ways that tragedy could become the foundation for joy. Victoria Sterling had died in Clearwater Creek, but her sons had found a father who loved them completely. Harold had lost Maria to a factory accident, but he had gained children who'd taught him that families could be built through choice and commitment rather than just biology. Carmen fell asleep planning their summer vacation itinerary with the detailed organization she'd inherited from both her parents. Alex and Danny whispered quietly about the science fair projects they wanted to attempt next year, their voices carrying the easy intimacy of brothers who'd learned to trust each other completely. Mrs. Gonzalez moved through the house below them, humming songs from her childhood while preparing for another day of shared meals and collaborative child-rearing. Outside, Millbrook Heights settled into another peaceful night, with its streets lined with modest homes where working families pursued dreams that might not make headlines, but that created the foundation for communities where children could grow up safely and loved. Harold fell asleep listening to the sounds of his household breathing steadily around him, grateful for the accidents of fate that had brought them together and the daily choices that kept them strong. Some stories ended with dramatic revelations or sweeping changes that transformed everything in single moments. Others concluded with the quiet satisfaction of ordinary happiness sustained over time, built through countless small acts of love and maintained through the simple commitment to showing up for each other day after day, year after year, until what had once felt impossible became as natural and necessary as breathing itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.